Welcome to the party. I'm Sam Ekstrom of Locked On Sports Minnesota. DeAndre Hopkins is on the market. We're going to have the obligatory, does DeAndre Hopkins have a spot on the Vikings conversation?
Hi, this is Arif Hasan from Pro Football Network. I've been called up from the DL to to perform, I think, some last minute miracles to get this podcast across the line. That and all of the bad ideas in this podcast were Sam's. All the good ones were mine.
It's a surprise Arif appearance on a Tuesday. Let's get into it on the Minnesota Football Party.
Locked On Sports Minnesota podcast. It's endless Minnesota Vikings talk with the diverse voices of your local experts. It's time for the Minnesota Football Party. It's your guys hanging out talking next level Vikings football. So join in with Pro Football Network's Arif Hasan, Locked On Vikings Luke Braun, Superior Sports Talk's Luke Inman, and Vikings insider Sam Ekstrom, plus the biggest names in Minnesota football for the Minnesota Football Party. And it starts now.
It's a Tuesday on the Minnesota Football Party. We were off on Monday, so this is the start of our week here on Locked On Sports Minnesota. Thanks so much for watching today. Normally, it's a Luke Inman production on Tuesdays. He's off today. Arif Hasan sitting in for him. He's at Arif Hasan NFL on Twitter, and he writes for Pro Football Network. You can find me on Twitter at Sam Ekstrom, and also find me on the Ron Johnson Show and the Minnesota Sports Rankum Show here on Locked On Sports Minnesota. Today's episode brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook partner of Locked On. Make every moment more at FanDuel.com/Locked On to get started. Today, OTA number 2 for the Minnesota Vikings. They will be on the practice field. I'll be out there later providing some reports. We will preview that. We will discuss the DeAndre Hopkins cut and where he might land. Could he be wearing purple? Is that even we'll put a percentage chance to it. How about that, Arif?
That sounds good. You know I love percentages.
Odds. Yeah, exactly. We'll also have a little bit of a Kirk Cousins conversation. What is the outlook moving forward at the quarterback position for the Minnesota Vikings? When in doubt, you talk about the QB. But Arif, I hope you had a good long weekend, and I appreciate you stepping in here last second, coming from the bullpen. That's very clutch of you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that you didn't point out that my baseball analogy was probably not great. I wasn't injured before, and I didn't really think about that, but that's fine. I'm not a baseball guy. I'm wearing a baseball tee, I think.
But. You used, well, first of all, you're frozen. Now, you're back. Perfect. You used the acronym DL, which is an antiquated acronym. They actually went to IL a couple of years ago. They went to injured list.
Oh, what? Why did they? Now I need to know. Why did they change?
So I don't know this for a fact. I wonder if the word disabled, though, was taboo in some way. Like if they felt
that's what
like,
the D stands for?
Yeah.
I mean, in this context, it actually makes a lot of very specific mechanistic sense, but I guess I understand why they changed it.
We'll leave that to Dan Hayes and Aaron Gleeman and the baseball guys. No, we talk football on this here show. DeAndre Hopkins is available. DeAndre Hopkins is very
technically accurate. Yes.
DeAndre Hopkins is very good. He has 11,000 career yards, 71 career touchdowns. And if you look at like over time, like receptions since 2018 or something like that, like DeAndre Hopkins is, I think, number one. He's very good, very consistent over time. He's been released by the Arizona Cardinals at the age of 30. The Vikings do have this kind of juicy cap space sitting out there, which we have assumed is reserved for extensions, and maybe someone like Leonard Floyd. But what percentage chance would you say the Vikings would move on DeAndre Hopkins?
Yeah, I would say probably. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if they reached out. Like, if we count that as a move, I think that the odds are high. But in terms of any realistic chance that they can add him to the roster, I'd say it's pretty low. I think that the things to kind of keep in mind here are kind of what teams were interested, why they decided not to trade for him, right? Because, you know, the trade was on the table regardless. And what his expectations are in free agency and what we can kind of compare him to. So first, I want to underscore, like, DeAndre Hopkins is extremely good. I think people know that, but it's not as if he's at a point where his age is genuinely a huge concern. I mean, he's no longer the best receiver in the NFL. So in that sense, his age has played a role. But in terms of him being a high-level receiver, it's still there. And to kind of add on to that statistical wonder that he is, I mean, he actually has more receptions than anybody in NFL history through age 30. I just retweeted it. I didn't realize that until this morning. Yeah, it's crazy, right? And then number 2 is Larry Fitzgerald. So nice run of receivers they've had in Arizona.
It must be a great organization there in Arizona that they're running.
I've heard nothing but good things about how they treat players. But but yeah, so the contract that he had, I think his average remaining was something like $14 million, and neither the Chiefs nor the Bills, who were the most interested in him, wanted to take that on, right? So I think that tells you something right there, right? That the teams that he had kind of indicated he was most interested in with his statements, like saying, "Hey, I'm gonna go to a team that's going to win a championship. I'm primarily concerned about positioning myself for a ring." Those teams don't have the capacity to take him on at a contract that makes sense. There's also kind of some word that the problem, because obviously Kansas City and Buffalo both tried to negotiate a new contract with them. I mean, that's just part of the trade negotiation, is that you reach out to the player. And apparently the problem, I think according to Florio, and I know Jeremy Fowler mentioned this as well over at ESPN, was that Odell Beckham's contract with the Baltimore Ravens, like $14-15 million, threw a wrench in the works. So he apparently wants to be paid more than that, maybe even closer to 20. I don't think a team is going to do that, right? If a team was going to do that, they wouldn't trade for him. But I do think that should set our expectations in terms of what the Vikings can hope to get out of it. Now, there is a theoretical contract structure that would work for them, right? If they put together a 2-year offer with 3 years void, right? You could fit it, because the Vikings have about $10 million in cap space after the top 51 rule, right? And $1 million of that won't count, right? Because the top 51 rule bumps the $960,000 Shelton Day contract off the accounting for the offseason. So it's basically $1 million off of a player that you're going to get until the actual season starts. You could construct a theoretical structure where he earns like about $15 million a year. His cap hit in year 1 is something like 6 or maybe 5. And
we haven't introduced Dalvin savings yet.
Right. And so that's another 7. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Again, you want to be careful, because a lot of that's going to be, like you said, used for extensions. Anything that's not used for extensions will be used for rollover, which will be used for extensions. Right. And so and obviously they're going to want to keep 5 around, just because, like, during the season, you might want to trade for TJ Hawkinson, or you might have to sign some street free agents. You want to have the free agent, you want to have the cap space available to you. And you can't just rely on, whoever's going to go on IR to free up that cap space, given the nature of those contracts. So that's going to be tough. But yeah, you'd want to keep around $5 million. If you've got $7 million coming down the pipe, with I guess it's both down the pipe and down the pike. If you look it up, both are accurate now. But language changes. But yeah, I mean, it is possible, right, to construct. But then you bring up the problem that in about 2025, you're going to have to take on a lot of dead cap space to construct that contract. And so if the Vikings are comfortable with that, and if they don't have any moves coming up that's going to complicate their 2025 cap space, whether that involves Justin Jefferson or Danielle Hunter or a quarterback, then you've got, that room, but you're only going to get probably 2-3 years out of this guy. Again, he's 30, right, or 31. And there's not that much left. We saw Adam Thielen drop off pretty significantly after hitting 31. Not that Thielen and Hopkins are kind of in the same category of receiver, but it's kind of instructive to have like a local example. So that's something to think about. But yeah, I mean, I think he would make the team better. No question. That's not the controversy or the issue. I think it would be awesome to see him and Jefferson and Addison line up and force KJ Osborne to prove that he can make the field, right? That would be dope. Whether or not it's worth a significant 2025 cap hit, whether or not it's worth the restrictions on your ability to create extensions now, I don't know if it is. But if it happens, I would be excited.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if DeAndre Hopkins kind of looks at this as a 1-year deal. with a chance to hit free agency when teams have more planning capability and more cap space. Because if you look at the teams that have, space available right now, there's not a lot of, Super Bowl contenders necessarily. The Bears.
I was about to say, how
Panthers.
good would the Bears offseason look if they finished it with a Hopkins signing?
My goodness, cherry on top. And if the Bears did it, then I think it would be in their best interest to try to make that a long-term deal. So then he can be part of the resurrection of the Chicago Bears. What if the Lions got him? I mean, this is, and hey, the Packers have cap space too, by the way.
Right? Yeah.
Vikings should maybe be nervous about this impending
Vikings should
free
sign him
agency.
to prevent the other NFC North team from playing.
Exactly. Yeah, because all of your division foes are in the top 6 right now in cap space. Vikings will actually join them once the Dalvin Cook move maybe happens.
That's so interesting.
A couple days from now.
It just feels like the NFC North is not typically one where all 4 teams are flush with cash. Like at least 2 of these teams are always up against the Vikings are of course always up against it.
Right.
It feels like until very recently the Bears were pretty up against it, and then they cleared out like 70 million in cap space. And the Packers are always weird because they have to extend their own players, which sometimes costs a lot. So yeah, just like a very interesting situation.
Yeah, I mean, liberating for the Packers too to not have that quarterback contract bogging them down, so to speak.
I'm sure they feel that way.
I'm sure they've felt like having an MVP caliber quarterback. Oh, what a burden.
Oh no.
But that DeAndre Hopkins falling somewhere, that could swing somebody's offseason. That could swing how a division race looks,
especially in the NFC. Because I mean, it's a tired talking point at this point, but like, given how weak the passing games are in the NFC, it really feels like this could take a team over the top. I think, to me, the biggest like odds changer, so I guess the team where he would make the biggest impact in that sense would probably be like the Dallas Cowboys, right? Everyone knows that they've kind of wanted to add another receiver. It would kind of add on to like they traded for Stephon Gilmore and Trevon Diggs, so they've got some aging vets that are going to supercharge an already good unit. Right. Dak Prescott we've been having I've seen this conversation on the timeline for about like the past week, ever since the Kirk Cousins Culpepper argument erupted. People are like, well, Kirk Cousins is like second in the NFC. It's like, well, I don't know. What about Dak Prescott? And so that question has been really interesting because Prescott was putting up just monstrously good numbers a few years ago, but hasn't put them up since. And last year, he's in this situation where he throws more interceptions than he's ever done before, but there's a really good argument to be made that he threw more interceptions than one would expect based off of his interceptable pass rate, even though he's always been an aggressive passer. Now, who does a great job dealing with tight window throws that Dak Prescott likes to throw? They need an outside player. CeeDee Lamb is great on the inside and pretty good on the outside. Having an outside receiver, I think that that's probably the biggest impact place that he could go. I don't know if the Cowboys have cap space. You're probably looking at it right now, but that would be probably the biggest area where you'd see a jump in their odds as potential Super Bowl contenders from the NFC.
Interesting. Yeah, they've got 7.9 effective cap space right now, and I don't know if they have mechanisms to clear some of that up. They probably do if they could restructure a guy and open that up. And Jerry Jones, that is a very Jerry Jonesian move to make.
Yeah, trade for Brandon Cooks and then sign DeAndre Hopkins. Woo!
Let me put you on the spot. We talked about this on Friday's roundtable, and you might not have it just at your disposal right away, or maybe you do because you're Arif Hasan, but we were discussing wide receiver trios currently in the NFL and where the Vikings trio of Osborne, Addison, and Jefferson ranks. And we actually had a pretty wide range of thoughts on that. Luke Inman was very bullish. Like, Luke Inman thought they were a top 5 wide receiver trio, and I was dubious whether they were even in the top 10. Just top of head, do you think the Vikings, as presently constructed, have a top 10 trio? And it gets complicated when you're weighting maybe the best in the NFL as your number 1. So taking all that into account.
That really complicates things. So off the top of my head, immediately the Bengals and the Seahawks come to mind as like almost certainly better in terms of trios, right? So there's no question about that. After that, obviously, if the Cowboys signed DeAndre Hopkins, that would change things. But what do you do with a team like the Eagles, whose duo is probably better than the Vikings duo, right? And then you have to figure out who's the Eagles' third receiver. At the moment, I don't know, right? And so that's kind of a question. I would have said the Raiders had they not traded Darren Waller, and also this weird situation with Davante Adams vis-a-vis Jimmy Garoppolo's health. I don't know. But, if it was like, Davante Adams and Hunter Renfrow and Darren Waller, I would probably take that group above the Vikings group. Man, after that, it's tough, right? There's a bunch of great duos right now. And a bunch of great, there's a lot of great potential out there, right? The Saints have a lot of potential to have a really good trio if Michael Thomas is healthy. And obviously Olave plays at the level that he was playing at. There's a lot of potential with the Washington Commanders with Jahan Dotson and Terry McLaurin and what they've been doing at receiver. I think you probably can throw the Buccaneers out. It's just not the same. The Jets, now that they've traded away Elijah Moore and have signed Alan Lazard, I think they're more of a duo than a trio. The Dolphins are more of a duo than a trio. Man,
Cedric Wilson would be their 3.
Yeah. And you can't really trust that. I also totally forgot about Jacoby Myers with the Raiders. So if they keep Hunter Renfrow, I'd take them above the Vikings, but not by a ton, right? I think that one's pretty close. Man, this one's, the Chargers, if they're healthy, the Chargers trio is probably better too. So it's probably close, but I think that having a top trio it sounds better because it's just not something that a lot of teams have anymore. You get the Chargers, you've got the Seahawks, you've got the Bengals. And then after that, it's kind of tough to figure out. I mean, the Bills not too long ago, when we were higher on Gabe Davis, right? Somebody that you'd want to maybe put in the conversation, or, the Raiders, again, just it depends on what they want to do with Hunter Renfrow and whether Davante Adams is like comfortable with being there, right? But yeah, that one maybe they're fringe top 5, but it's not as impressive as that sounds, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that the Vikings trio is so based on potential that I've just got a hard time buying in on them as much as I would even with maybe a less top-heavy but deeper trio like Denver's, like Sutton, Judy, and Patrick. Those guys have all had 800-yard seasons before.
It's tough because when you say trio, you're presupposing, right, that the third receiver is going to matter in your calculation. And so, like you said, how you downweight having the best receiver in the league against the group. Because I think if you ask somebody outright, would you rather have Denver's group of 3 or the Vikings group of 3? You say the Vikings, right?
Right.
But like when you're discussing trios, that's almost not even how you look at it, right? It's how you evaluate how much that like third receiver contributes. And so it is like kind of just like a weird thing to have to fully wrap your head around in terms of like figuring it out. And what's interesting is that, we talk a lot about how, hey, the Vikings trio has the potential to be really good. If Osborne, continues to take another step, if Addison is the first round receiver we think he is, if that's how you want to talk about it, the Ravens trio for like the first time in a long time has potential, right? In the same way the Vikings does, right? If Odell Beckham returns to form, right? If Zay Flowers is the first round receiver people think he is, if Rashad Bateman, kind of figures it out, I don't know, right? Like it's tough because if we're talking about trios and we're incorporating potential, it is really difficult to throw out some of these teams.
Yeah, I just think if a national person or someone from a different market looked on paper at the Vikings compared to other teams, I think a lot of people would just cast off Osborne. They would say,
yes,
that's a wide receiver 3. He's never proven anything. He's never had more than, is it 500 yards or 600 yards in his career? Right? So I can see where there'd be skepticism there. All that to say, if the Vikings made a move for Hopkins, and that would be a bold move, and I'm not sure that it's aligned with kind of where their time horizon is, right, but if they made that move for a 1-year kind of rental deal, I think they're right behind Cincinnati. I think that their trio would be number 2. You could make an argument for number 1 in the league.
I would still say probably 3 behind the Seahawks. I mean, like Tyler Lockett is criminally underrated, I think.
Yeah,
just generally.
But their 3 is a rookie, right? You're assuming JSN?
Yeah, I mean, just like the Vikings, right?
Okay.
I prefer JSN over Addison, right? So I think that's part of it.
Yeah.
Obviously I prefer Jefferson over Lockett, but I would take both Lockett and DK over Osborne. And then if we're including Hopkins, right, I think that I would say that I would like last year's Lockett. It was probably better than last year's Hopkins, despite the history of play that both have had. That, obviously the career that you would, no question, would take Hopkins. Last year, I think that Lockett was more useful to his team than Hopkins was. And I openly acknowledge that, the way that the passing game played out for Arizona was night and day different when Hopkins wasn't available, that they actually only had a passing game once Hopkins was there. But Lockett is that good. And so it's kind of this kind of middle area is a little bit better than what the Vikings top would be. You just have more receivers that you'd be comfortable putting in your top 10, top 15. So that's that. And then you have to figure out whether or not, like, what you consider the Chargers to be, whether or not Keenan Allen still has it, whether or not, Mike Williams is reliable enough. Right. And then you've got the Quentin Johnston thing with them. So I would probably put the Vikings ahead of the Chargers in that scenario, just because, again, if I'm waiting for recency, I would rather take, Hopkins over that group. But it is entirely possible that even with Hopkins, that they're behind that top three. It's just funny because that's already kind of where we were putting them anyway. It's just that the Cincinnati is just so good as a 3-receiver spot. You can't really dislodge them.
Yeah, no doubt. I don't know if we ever actually nailed down a number. Give me a percentage chance the Vikings move on this.
Move on this as in make an offer, or move on this as add him to the roster?
They add him to the roster.
2%.
Okay. If that's the over-under,
yeah,
I'm going to go under. I think it's super duper long shot.
All right. I mean, fair. Yeah.
Yeah. Good discussion, though. I mean, worthwhile. Let's talk about Kirk Cousins, a polarizing topic amongst Vikings fans. After I remind folks that we are brought to you by Built Bar. Built is nutritious and delicious. It's made with 100% real dark chocolate. It tastes amazing, and yet it's still healthy for you. It's got 17 grams of protein, gives your body some good fuel with those amazing macros, only 4 grams of sugar, so it's not weighing you down, making you sleepy. It's not unhealthy for you. These are the best tasting protein bars in the world, and they are so nutritious. You can get them at Walmart or Sam's Club. Go to the pharmacy section, pick up a 4-bar box or a 13-bar box. Get the puffs, get the normal bars. You can get flavors like peanut butter brownie, cookies and cream, or brownie batter. That's Walmart, Sam's Club, or the specialty flavors also available at Built.com. Have them shipped right to your door. Built Bar. Stock up this summer. You can thank me later. All right, Arif. Let's dive headlong into Kirk Cousins. He is the quarterback on this roster, and under contract next year, Jaren Hall. Is Nick Mullins under contract now? I don't think he signed a multi-year deal, but let me check on that. Point is, Nick Mullins is not your quarterback next year. He is under contract, by the way.
Okay, sure.
Jaren Hall is unlikely to be your quarterback week 1 next year. So what are the options? What are the options facing this Vikings team with an expiring Cousins deal? Kirk Cousins, to me, in my mind, he feels like somebody that if he hit free agency, he would not necessarily value going to the highest bidder. And I believe he didn't the last time he hit free agency.
That's correct.
I believe he took less.
He did.
To play for the Vikings. My gut tells me that if the Vikings are in a pickle in free agency, I think they believe that they can still sign Kirk Cousins back if he's on the open market. I think that is a possibility for them. Do you agree with that? Or do you think that they need to have something figured out before the end of the year?
They would. I think that Cousins is still savvy enough to negotiate teams against each other, right? Like and actually when he shot it sounded like it was going to be like a documentary. Remember when he initially signed, like in 2018, and there was like a documentary series that he shot, and it made it seem like there was going to be multiple episodes. But as far as I could tell, there was one episode.
The climactic moment of that show was like just such a calm phone call.
Yeah,
and he puts the phone down and he's like, "Well, we got what we wanted." Man, this team's gonna have a great fight song, Skull Vikings, and he told his wife about the Vikings fight song. It was such a
what a gift for visual language. Just an artsy filmmaker, I think. So in that documentary series, he does negotiate, he does leverage the Jets against the Vikings, but he ends up taking the deal that has more guaranteed, and he ends up going to this team situation that I think he prefers. I don't think he said that specifically, but I think that played a role. I think, again, he's going to seek out a fully guaranteed contract. It's going to limit the numbers of his contract in free agency, especially now at this age. But I think that he will still leverage teams against each other. So the Vikings would end up paying more. So the Access Vikings podcast had intimated that the Cousins team had offered a $40 million extension, fully guaranteed, of course. How else would it go? And that number to me struck me as actually a little bit generous on Cousins' side, and the team still said no. So the reasons that they would say no and essentially end negotiations before free agency likely means that they thought that there was a possibility, right, that they could draft a guy, in the first 3 rounds, not like, Jaron Hall, right? And now that the draft has passed and they have not drafted a guy in the first 3 rounds, they don't have a quarterback that they consider to be a potential quarterback of the future in any realistic sense. Of course, Jaron Hall could surprise them, but it would be a surprise. Now that that's happened, they may reopen negotiations. And I think it's kind of worth discussing, even though we talk about a Cousins extension all the time and what they're going to do with him, because the free agency occurs before the draft. Are the Vikings going to enter the draft with no quarterback if they pick in the middle of the draft, right? If they pick late if they go to the playoffs, right? So, it's entirely possible they go to the playoffs. I don't think that's outside of given what the NFC North looks like, right? So if they pick middle to late draft, which I think is the most likely scenario, are they going to enter free agency without a quarterback and let Kirk Cousins kind of dictate what that market looks like for him? Maybe, but I don't think that $40 million deal is on the table for them anymore, right? I think that, if they reopen negotiations, Kirk Cousins and his team are just going to be like, so you wanted us a little bit more than that, huh? Well, the price has gone up. Yesterday's price is not today's price. It's the situation has changed. Your options have closed down, and so the price goes up. So I think that they would prefer to get that done before free agency because, and again, I think that they prefer a short-term deal, right? But I think that heading into next year's draft, which again will be replete with quarterbacks if expectations, are going to be met, right? This might be another 4 quarterback draft, right? I mean, a lot of people have been talking about like Drake May and Caleb Williams at the top, but there's other quarterbacks that might slip into the first round. Some unknown, like an Anthony Richardson, could make it into the first round. Like relative unknown to casual college fans like me. But like, it's entirely possible it's a 4 quarterback draft. And if it's a 4 quarterback draft, they might enter free agency thinking we got to have a short-term deal because we're going to try at a quarterback again. But if it's not, if it's just Drake May and Caleb Williams at the top, right, it might have to be a longer-term deal. So I think that if we hear reports that they've re-entered negotiations with Cousins, that is an indication that they clearly thought that they could have a shot at a quarterback in the draft, right? It would confirm the rumors and reports that the Vikings were trying to trade up for a quarterback. I confirm in like a vague, indirect sense, right? Not in the reporting version of confirmed, but in this is a compelling argument to be making confirmed.
Yeah. I just don't know what possibility were they hoping for then? Because
trading all they had to move up into the top 7.
Because they weren't trading up to 1.
Nope.
And it sounds like they loved Bryce Young. It sounds like maybe that was the guy. They really thought that was an earnest possibility that they were going to get Bryce Young.
Given like all of the weirdness that the Panthers were putting out there, right? It's like, oh, we just decided to trade up to 1 without even thinking about, which quarterback we like. They're all good. Who knows? We won't make a decision until we have all of the information. We'll go to all the pro days, really obviously important part of the process. We'll interview all of them 4 times. We'll send private investigators to each of their families. Right? Like we're going to dig deep. And they're putting that out there. There's, a 5%, 2%, 1% chance. The Vikings are like, I don't know, Bryce Young might fall. right? Like the Vikings could just been like,
so they risked letting Cousins walk on the. There's a greater chance the Vikings signed DeAndre Hopkins than Bryce Young was going to fall and somehow get scooped up by the Vikings.
Correct, but the risk is a lot lower than you think, right? Because they have Cousins under contract this year. They've got an entire year to hold a negotiating window, and it's not like Lamar, right? Cousins has an agent. You can talk to him during the year. Cousins doesn't have to focus on negotiations. One day his agent will just be like, hey, great news. We negotiated a deal. And Cousins is like, cool, I'll sign it, and then I'll go back to my office to study film.
Yeah, I wonder if the Vikings do just kind of take advantage and not maliciously, but they just know who they're dealing with. They know that it's not like hardball for Cousins. And I know people make a point of how much money he's made. He's not a ruthless negotiator. Like, the market has dictated what he's made. I don't think these have been contentious negotiations at all over the years when he's gotten extensions. Like, I tend to think that he kind of his agent handles things like you said. And I think he values continuity. And he has that right now in Minnesota for the first time. So I'm not sure he's super excited to interrupt that and go somewhere new. Is there a bridge quarterback path? Like, does this franchise hasn't had a bridge quarterback since Matt Castle. Options for next year would be Ryan Tannehill, Jacoby Brissett, Marcus Mariota, Jameis Winston, perhaps. What is the percentage chance that it ends up being the route?
It's weird because like Jacoby Brissett is the only one that I like out of all of those options. Like, if you'd asked me that a year ago, I would have said, yeah, Ryan Tannehill, of course. Now it's Jacoby. Did you see how he played with the Browns? That was outstanding.
I didn't watch a lot of Browns football. I know you watch every game, so you would know better than me. But
he was genuinely like a pleasure to watch. It just surprised me so much.
Why were they bad?
When Deshaun Watson started?
Well, no, when Jacoby Brissett played, he was also bad.
No. He was like 7th in EPA per play for a while. So a big part of it was that they were very poor in late game situations. I mean, that's just why they started losing games. But his level of play was pretty high. The offensive line isn't what it was supposed to be. You know, it's supposed to be a top 3 offensive line. It didn't play like that. But he and Amari Cooper played really well. Nick Chubb played really well. It was primarily an issue of, late games. And you know me, I think late games tend to be more coin flips than anything else. And a defense that was persistently injured, right? That didn't have, the capability to keep up. There were some offensive collapses late in games, but again, it's just kind of the nature of things. But they got a lot worse once Deshaun Watson started. Deshaun Watson was playing like a 31st ranked quarterback, and Jacoby Brissett was playing like a top 10 guy. So it was just very, stark. And QBR,
we're talking best ever QBR, best over quarterback rating, just to support what you're saying. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, he was playing some pretty outstanding football. And as a bridge quarterback, that you could do a lot worse, right? You could end up with like last year's Ryan Tannehill, which was just overly disappointing so much that they benched him for a guy that they didn't even want to play, Malik Willis, right? They benched him and they were like, Malik Willis is not ready, but throw him out there. And then Mariota. The only reason that Atlanta Falcons offense was ever productive, and it was only productive for like the first 6 or 7 games, is because of how well Arthur Smith coordinated that offense. And it needed to be a running offense, which is not something Mariota has done since college. Obviously at Oregon, he was a very good running quarterback, but they just didn't like him running the ball at Tennessee. And I kind of understand it. And they needed that to get production. So I'm not huge on Mariota. Tannehill, I think it's kind of past his time. So it would be Jacoby Brissett, but that bridge quarterback scenario, I think, is an option. And it's kind of the only option, given the way the Vikings have talked about all of this, where they want to be consistently competitive, that when they build for the future, there's a plan in place right now to win now. But that bridge quarterback is kind of, if they're coherent and consistent in their philosophy, and teams might not be, they could just lie, right? That's just, we have to always acknowledge that that's a possibility. But if that is truly their philosophy, they have to get a bridge quarterback, right? Whether it's we're going to sign Cousins to a 2-year extension, draft a first-round quarterback, let that guy sit for 2 years, or It's we're going to sign Jacoby Brissett. He's going to be awesome for about a year. Maybe take us into the playoffs if we build the right team around him. I don't know. And then our rookie is going to be ready to go, right? I think it's really unlikely that they are ever going to want to roll into a season with a rookie quarterback unless they pick that guy number 1 or number 2, right? Like if we were in a situation where where Bryce Young falls to 3 or whatever, and the Vikings trade everything they have, right? They're like, hey, Arizona, you seem like a team that wants Za'Darius Smith. You seem like a team, that wants Dalvin Cook. And hey, we'll take off that DeAndre Hopkins contract for you, just free, gratis, right? And I bet you could use a bushel of picks for the next 3 years, right? So if they do that and they grab Bryce Young, they could probably trade Cousins away and just be comfortable that Bryce Young is going to start right away. But I think most even first round quarterback situations, right, they would want that guy to sit just because their philosophy, again, if they're honest and consistent, their philosophy is such that they want to have a really good shot of making the playoffs every single year. And for that to happen, your quarterback needs to be ready, and you just cannot guarantee that if you're like in an Anthony Richardson situation.
The bridge quarterback does open things up for maybe it's Jaron Hall, maybe it's next year's guy, but that does at least allow for your young quarterback to take over in some circumstance.
Yeah, if he just like wins the camp competition, like if it's like, yeah, I know we signed Matt Flynn, but Russell Wilson's doing real well in camp, right? Like if it's that situation, it allows you to do that without feeling too bad, without having to pay Matt Flynn money, which I'm sure if we looked at the contract now wouldn't seem so drastic, but of course in 2012 was pretty substantial.
Who did Prescott beat out in 2016?
What a wonderful question that is. Let's find out.
Because I'm trying to think of, and obviously Hall is not going to beat out Cousins this year, but I'm trying to think of middle round quarterbacks that have won a job with no NFL experience. So basically Hall next year, is there any precedent for a 5th round pick to start a season as the quarterback with no prior experience?
With no, as a rookie, right? Because Sam Howell is starting, right?
But Sam Howell. There you go.
Yeah. Yep. But I mean, he sat for a year, and Taylor Heineke was ahead of him.
Yeah, and that's what I mean with Hall next year. Like Hall will have a year under his belt, but no priors to suggest that he could do it. Yeah.
Yeah. By the way, Dak Prescott beat out Tony Romo, but Tony Romo was like too injured, so it doesn't really count.
Got
it. So that was a situation where I don't think they had planned for Prescott to start, and then they were kind of forced to, and it turns out he was actually quite good. But otherwise, like Russell Wilson, 3rd rounder, so that kind of counts. Not quite a 3rd round investment is a little bit more substantial than a 5th round investment, but I mean, there's not a ton of precedent out there. I think did Tony Romo sit for a year or 2 before he started? He's undrafted, right? Famously. So it would be pretty rare, but it would be a Sam Howell type situation.
That's actually, now that you've pointed out that comparison, that may actually help inform me, in my opinion, and maybe the Vikings, maybe not, probably not at all, because they're really 2 different people. But if a 5th round pick can go to Washington and have some measure of success this year, that does maybe take the stigma away from what the Vikings would face next year with Jaron Hall. I'm just saying, because the Commanders have controversially chosen not to really have any competition for Howell that's meaningful.
They were, I don't know if aggressive is the right word, but very open about how much they were not going to challenge Sam Howell. They were just like, he played for like 2 games last year, and that's all we needed. What a stud. What a great quarterback this dude is. We're just going to trust that. They did, by the way, if we're speaking about Jacoby Brissett, they did bring Jacoby Brissett in, right? So, but I mean, they were very like, we're not going to go after Lamar. Why would we go after Lamar Jackson? Who even is that? We're going to start Sam Howell. And, the draft, there are quarterbacks in this year's draft. First time hearing about this. We're going to start Sam Howell. Like, it was very, like, this is what's happening.
The egg on face potential is just magnificent.
In Washington?
Yeah. a place that has really an infallible reputation.
Just a strong history of success on and off the field.
Locked On Sports Minnesota is partnered with SiriusXM. You can hear our programming on the SiriusXM app and also all the games of all the local teams, including the Twins, who play at Houston tonight. Big win yesterday, trying to string something together tonight. 7:10 p.m. first pitch. Here, Corey Provis and the gang, the whole every pitch of the hometown broadcast on the SXM app. Just search Twins. In closing, Arif, OTAs continue today. I'll be out there at the practice field at TCO, tweeting at Sam Ekstrom. What do you want to hear? What do you want to hear come out of TCO today, Arif? What are you watching for?
Well, I wanna know what's happening in the defensive back group generally, right? Is Lewis Cine taking first team reps? OTAs, it's not like watching training camp where like the reps matter a lot, but there is still a first team, second team, and so on. So is Lewis Cine taking reps? Where does Jay Ward fit in? How many safeties are we seeing on the field on a consistent basis? Because one of the things about this group is that it's got a very, very versatile defensive back group, whether it's Jay Ward or Cameron Bynum, who've got the ability to play in the slot. You've got Lewis Cine, who's probably better suited as a strong safety, but so is Harrison Smith, and they can both play free safety just fine. So what's going to happen there, right? The reports coming out of camp right now, OTAs right now, are interesting with regards to the way that the Vikings defense is set up, right? Because the offense has been talking about how intense it was and how they're throwing looks out there on the first day of OTAs, an install that you wouldn't see until 15 days into training camp, much less OTAs. And who knows, right? All OTA storylines are, not baked, not fully baked yet, right? Like they're just they're not quite there, and seeing like, it's a multiple defense out at OT. Like, who knows if that's like a real thing? But the way the players have responded to it, at least according to the stories I've read over at the Pioneer Press and the Athletic, follow Dane Mitsutani and Alec Lewis, wonderful writers. And Sam's all right too. The stories coming out
all right.
All right, is that these offensive players are flabbergasted, genuinely stunned by how advanced the defense was on day one. And I am going to believe that for now. I'm going to believe, right? Because I've been to a number of OTAs. Those defenses don't look complex. And that's not just because it's not just because I watched like last year's Ed Donatel defense. I've been through a number of Vikings defenses, including famously complex Mike Zimmer defenses. And the first day of OTAs does not show anything interesting. Maybe they line up a couple of people at the line of scrimmage a little bit more than usual, but it tends to be fairly vanilla. So the fact that it's not is at least interesting. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. It could be a bad thing, right? It might be important to install the fundamentals, have, the basics down before you start overcomplicating things and overwhelming your players, right? That was the problem with the 2020 defense, right? Is that they overwhelmed the players with the complexity of the defense. Also, the players were not very good. Those are both important problems to point out. But, the miscommunication errors were pretty substantial in 2020, up until basically midway through the season. So is it an overly complicated defense, or is Brian Flores doing something like really interesting about the way that he's communicating this defense? So I want to see how that storyline progresses. I also want to see if they're already installing, a lot of play action on offense, because one of the things that Kevin O'Connell has talked about is how they just didn't get to play action as often as they wanted to. And how can you do that? Right. And so they invested in the running game to make sure that they could do that. I'm not convinced that that's a necessity, but he's the coach. I'm not. But how many times are we seeing two tight ends? How many times are we seeing one tight end but two running backs? What does that offense look like? Is it actually going to be an offense that has that many two receiver scenarios where you've only got two on the field? I don't know. It sounded like neither Justin Jefferson nor Jordan Addison were on the field last time. I don't know what that situation is going to look like this time. But if they aren't, who's taking those reps? Because it sounded like Jalen Naylor was out there with KJ Osborne. Is that going to continue? So, there's a lot of like, what does the depth chart look like kind of things. But like the ways that this team is supposed to change, right? The back end of the defense, the kind of structure of the offense. Those are the things that I want to see, like how it evolves based off of kind of what our expectations are and whether or not they've been spending all offseason just, selling us a bridge.
Get ready for the stories after, if we see more defensive complexity. Get ready for the stories. The defense is ahead of the offense at this stage of the offseason. The defense is winning these practices because they were sticky. They were aggressive last week. They were shutting down receivers, cutting off passing lanes. I thought they looked like they were playing at a faster pace, even though the offense has much more reason to be looking faster. It's one practice.
Right.
One practice. We'll see what happens today. Maybe O'Connell will adapt and hit the defense with a little something extra
and also,
of his own.
What receivers were they sticking to? It seems like that is a critical component of this particular equation.
Maybe not. I don't know. I'm not going to slander Jalen Naylor. He was making plays out there. If anything,
was he? It sounds like the defense was pretty sticky.
Yeah, well, they were sticky. He made catches in traffic, so they were sticky.
Oh, they both looked good. They were both.
Everybody looked great. The receivers' morale is up, but the coverage was sound. Everybody was Josh Robinson. Mike Hughes. All right. Well, we'll watch for those things. You can follow along on my Twitter at Sam Ekstrom. You can follow Arif Hasan's work covering the National Football League at ProFootballNetwork.com. And he'll be back on Thursday with Luke Braun and Luke Inman. We'll also have Reggie Wilson on tomorrow's show to break down the purple and talk about what we saw today at OTAs. You can find videos of press conferences from OTAs at the Locked On Sports Minnesota YouTube channel. Subscribe there. Get all of our shows and those Vikings pressers. Thanks so much, Arif. We'll talk to you soon. This has been the Minnesota Football Party on Locked On Sports Minnesota.